All right, guys, so this is part two of chapter 9, and we're really going to kind of go through a little bit about what we talked about in class the other day with what now. We talked about what now for your personal, in your personal life when you go off to college and you do that kind of stuff. And today we're going to talk about what now for the United States in the wake of the revolution. And we're going to see that we go through a pretty dark time in the immediate aftermath of peace for a number of different reasons, and some of them are our own doing. Some of them are external factors. So we're going to go through a pretty dark period here in the next 15 minutes or so for our country. So after the Paris Peace Treaty is signed, we have what's known as the Second Continental Congress. And basically it's just a bunch of ambassadors for each state. There's no authority. There's no, written constitution that we're operating under. We're kind of just spitballing and going with our gut here. There's some control over military and foreign policy. It's very limited, but in terms of domestic responsibilities, there is no unification. There is no united front. Each one of the 13 what were colonies, and we'll now refer to them as states from now on, each of the 13 states were sovereign. They had control over their own domestic affairs, and even some of their non-domestic affairs in terms of relations with Indians, in terms of abilities to make peace treaties and defense. But the big things that we'll hit on are they are able to coin their own money. They can have their own armies and navies. They're really militias more than anything else, and they have control over their own trade issues. They can put up their own tariffs. They can enforce their own tariffs. It's really there's really not a whole lot of unity on any front in the Second Continental Congress. Now, out of the Second Continental Congress, we get this thing called the Articles of Confederation. It's adopted by the Congress that year in 1777, but because of some of the, for lack of a better word, anarchy of the situation, it's not actually ratified until 4 years later in 1781, and we'll get to the struggle for ratification or adoption. Ratified just means to approve. We don't get to that point until 1781. We'll talk about how we get there in just a minute. But the big sort of sticking points was all of those lands to the west of the Allegheny Mountain Range. Remember, the whole reason that we had fought the French and Indian War, and I know that this is going back a couple chapters, the whole reason we had fought the French and Indian War, that was to be able to expand into those lands west of the Allegheny Mountains. That was the whole reason we fought the French. That's the whole reason that we were angry at the British for restricting our ability to expand into those lands. Was that proclamation line of 1763, and now we're seeing it be a bone of contention for the third time, really. Now it's sort of among ourselves. There are 6 states that have no territorial claims beyond the Allegheny Mountains, and 7, mostly New York and Virginia, had huge land, holdings in that area. And these land-rich states are able to use those lands in terms of selling those lands, in terms of, mining the resources from those lands in order to pay off their state debt. And that becomes a very, very large bone of contention. This is the big reason why we have so much delay in the approval of the Articles of Confederation, is because the Founding Fathers, with regards to the Articles, required unanimous approval, meaning that all 13 states had to approve the Articles in order for them to take full effect. Maryland is going to be your state that holds out all the way until March of 1781, and basically they wanted land. They said, we're going to hold out until we get some of this land that is west of the Alleghenies, and New York finally surrenders its western lands in order to get Maryland on board, and they are the 13th to ratify. And Congress pledges to use these vast areas of land for the common benefit of all. But what we find is that it's really kind of hard to have a common benefit when there's nothing to really unite you. They do have a somewhat of a plan to make that area of land into several new states that would be admitted to the Union, or what we commonly think of as the Union. But in reality, that would have been very, very difficult to do in the long term, because there's just so much quarreling, there's so much fighting going on amongst the states. What we will get into, though, is in just a minute, though, is the way that we use those lands. Now, the Articles of Confederation themselves, it's basically just a league of friendship is all it is. There's really nothing that binds them domestically. The 13 independent states, they're just sort of linked together. And the biggest thing is foreign affairs. That's really the one sort of linchpin that links them all together, is just the idea that we need to band together in large scale defense. Congress is really your only governmental agency. There is no executive to enforce any laws that were to be passed by Congress. Judicial issues are left entirely to the states. The central government does not get involved really at all. And even though Congress is really the only governmental body on the sort of large scale or national level, it's got some serious impediments. For example, each state only has a single vote, and all bills that are deemed important, and the term important there is loose and vague, and that becomes a problem as well. Any important bill requires the support of 9 out of 13 states. That's a really hard majority to reach. You're not going to find, especially when the states have such a broad range of domestic interests, you're really going to struggle to find issues that you can get 9 of the 13 states to agree on. Any amendment to the Articles, if you wanted to change the way that the government worked at a functional level, you had to have unanimous ratification, and that's something that just does not happen. I challenge you, and we'll talk about this a little bit in class, I challenge you to get, 13 of your friends together and try to decide on where to eat. That becomes very, very difficult sometimes, let alone trying to come up with, hard and fast policies on things like trade. Now, as weak as Congress was, it was really very intentional. And you could kind of understand this, going back to the movie The Patriot, and the quote about, why should I trade one tyrant 3,000 miles away? They did not want a large tyrannical central government. That's not what they wanted, because they had just thrown off sort of the yoke of a large tyrannical government. So they didn't want to have to be burdened by that central government. In effect, really what our founding fathers did in the early goings is they were willing to trade that one tyrant 3,000 miles away for 3,000 tyrants 1 mile away, because that's really what the Articles of Confederation is going to turn into. Of all the weaknesses in the articles that I've already sort of hit on, the two big ones are there's no power to regulate commerce, and Congress can't really even enforce its own tax collection, and its tax collection, in effect, is non-existent. Essentially, when it comes to tax collection, the Articles of Confederation relies on voluntary sort of donations from each of the 13 states. And as you can imagine, that just does not go terribly well. You have northern states who are saying that, we have all of this debt. We all need to sort of pitch in and foot the bill. And you have southern colonies, especially like Georgia, even the Carolinas to a certain extent, that were very loyalist during the Revolution, who say, we didn't really want this war, you guys pay for it. So it's hard to sort of operate on a donation-based tax collection system. in dealing with the states, Congress can't force really the independent states to do anything that they don't want to do, nor can it go and specifically prosecute individuals. It's really just a very large, ineffectual body that we've come up with. And again, that's done partially intentionally. Now, this new Congress is actually less effective, therefore, than the Continental Congress that we saw during the Revolution. It is, however, a big step towards a constitution that we'll get to later in this chapter, rather. And it does sort of act as a model in that regard. Whether specifically written down on paper or not, it does sort of give us an idea of what the national government, what powers the national government should have. And it does sort of keep at least the idea of national unity alive, even though there's really not a whole lot of unity to be seen right now. It does kind of keep that idea, at least in the theoretical sense, it does sort of keep it attainable. So it is landmark in the sense that it is the first document and the first government really of its kind, as ineffectual as it was. Now, I mentioned earlier, one of the high points, really the only high point that we have to discuss, is with regards to land. The Articles of Confederation does really actually set us up in a good way for future land expansion. The Old Northwest is defined basically as the Ohio River Valley. And the Land Ordinance of 1785 actually sets up an orderly process to actually sell those tracts of land and use that money to pay for the national debt. This is where we get the county and township structure that we have today. The land would be surveyed into large sections that we would consider today counties, and then would be divided, therefore, into townships. And then within those townships would be divided into sections, and those sections would be sold off. And every 16th section sold, those funds go directly to education. So there is a very definite structure here in terms of the division of land, in terms of using those funds for the public good. This is really a very, very good piece of legislation, and something that we can look to in the future as we sort of plot our way through. This is going to be one of those things that we can look at and say this is a positive, and this is something that we can build on moving forward. You then have the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. Basically, this is how we're going to deal on a government level with those territories that we're auctioning off. Basically, it sets up sort of the temporary status of what we would consider later under the Constitution to be a territory, and then eventually sets up the stages to where they could be brought into the federal government. For example, it sets the inhabitants requirement at 60,000, which sounds like a lot, but which may not sound like a lot, rather. May not sound like a lot today, but back then 60,000 people is actually a fair number of people, and then it could be admitted into the state. One key point moving forward is that this ordinance forbids slavery in the Old Northwest. Slavery is going to become a very, very key issue that we're going to have to continue to deal with, obviously, as we move through the rest of history and leading up to the Civil War. And this is one of those things that we're going to come back to. I think we will actually pause there because now we're going to get into sort of our struggles internationally, and then we'll get into really a lot of our domestic struggles. So we maybe didn't get as negative as I thought we would in this section, but believe me, things are going to get worse before they get better. So we'll see you in the next section.